On a gray Tuesday morning in November of 1981, Dorothy Hansen sat at her cluttered desk in the billing department of Mountain Bell Telephone Company in Denver, Colorado, squinting at a computer printout that made absolutely no sense. The numbers stared back at her with the stubborn inconsistency that had defined her entire morning, a pattern of long-distance charges that violated every rule she had learned during 23 years of reconciling customer accounts. She had investigated billing errors before, thousands of them, the result of computer glitches or customer disputes or simple data entry mistakes. But this was different. This was wrong in a way that made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up, though she could not yet articulate why. She thought she was looking at a routine accounting discrepancy. She had no idea she was staring at the first thread of a Soviet espionage operation that would unravel across 3 states and expose a network of agents who had been operating undetected for nearly a decade. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Dorothy Hansen was 47 years old that autumn. A sturdy woman with graying brown hair she kept in a practical perm and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. She had joined Mountain Bell in 1958, fresh out of high school, starting as a switchboard operator in the days when making a long-distance call required connecting dozens of physical wires through manual exchange boards. She had watched the telephone industry transform from human operators to mechanical switches to the computer systems that now tracked every call made in the Rocky Mountain region. Her husband, Carl, worked maintenance at the local school district. Her 3 children had grown and moved away, leaving Dorothy and Carl in the same modest ranch house they had bought in 1963. Where the kitchen still had the original avocado green appliances, and the living room carpet bore the permanent indentations of furniture that had occupied the same positions for nearly 2 decades. Dorothy's job had evolved over the years, following the technological changes that swept through telecommunications. By 1981, she worked in the audit and billing department, a windowless office on the 3rd floor of Mountain Bell's downtown Denver headquarters, where she and 11 other analysts reconciled discrepancies between the computerized billing system and the physical records of toll calls. It was tedious work that required meticulous attention to detail, the ability to spot patterns in columns of numbers that stretched across green and white striped computer paper, and the patience to track down errors that might involve calls made months earlier. The telephone company's billing system was complex, involving multiple databases that tracked different aspects of each customer's service. Local calls within the customer's exchange were unlimited and included in the monthly base rate. Long-distance calls, however, were itemized separately, with charges based on distance, duration, and time of day. The system logged every toll call with timestamp, originating number, destination number, duration, and cost. These records formed the basis of each customer's monthly bill, but they also created an enormous amount of data that had to be reconciled, verified, and archived. Dorothy's specific responsibility involved investigating accounts where the computer-generated bill did not match the physical call records, situations that suggested either a technical malfunction or deliberate tampering. Most discrepancies were innocent. A customer would call to dispute a charge, claiming they never made a particular long-distance call, and Dorothy would trace through the records to determine whether the charge was legitimate or the result of a crossed line or misassigned number. Sometimes the computer system would generate duplicate charges or fail to properly credit payments, creating artificial balances that required manual correction. Occasionally, enterprising customers would attempt to manipulate their bills by disputing legitimate charges in hopes of getting them waived, and Dorothy had developed an instinct for identifying these fraudulent claims. But the account in front of her that Tuesday morning fit none of these familiar patterns. The customer was Dr. Richard Chambers, a research scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, a prestigious laboratory located in the foothills west of Boulder. Dr. Chambers had called the billing department 3 days earlier to dispute several charges on his October statement, claiming he had not made any of the long-distance calls listed to various numbers in California, New York, and Virginia. His complaint had been routed to Dorothy for investigation, and she had pulled up his account records expecting to find the usual explanation: a teenage child making unauthorized calls, or perhaps a crossed line that had resulted in another customer's charges appearing on his bill. Instead, she found something that made no sense at all. According to the computerized billing system, Dr. Chambers' home phone line had been used to make 17 long-distance calls during October, totaling nearly $127 in charges. The calls were made at various times throughout the month, mostly during evening hours, to numbers scattered across the country. Each call lasted between 7 and 23 minutes, and the pattern suggested someone conducting business or personal conversations rather than random misdials. But when Dorothy cross-referenced these calls against the physical toll records, the underlying documentation that tracked calls through the actual telephone switching equipment, she discovered that no such calls existed. The toll, tickets, the paper records generated by the mechanical switches that routed long-distance calls, showed no corresponding entries for any of the calls that appeared on Dr. Chambers' bill. It was as though the calls had been created entirely within the computer system, without ever actually occurring. Dorothy's first assumption was that this represented a computer malfunction, perhaps a glitch that had inserted phantom calls into Dr. Chambers' account. She spent an hour checking the system logs and database records, looking for evidence of processing errors or data corruption that might explain the discrepancy. She found nothing. The call records appeared normal in every respect, except for the fundamental problem that they did not correspond to any actual telephone activity. She then considered whether someone might have manually entered false charges into the system, perhaps as part of an internal fraud scheme by a Mountain Bell employee. But that theory made no sense either. Why would someone create phantom charges on a customer's account? There was no obvious way for an employee to profit from such manipulation, and the risk of discovery seemed disproportionate to any potential gain. As Dorothy puzzled over the problem, she decided to expand her investigation beyond Dr. Chambers' account. She queried the billing database for other accounts that might show similar discrepancies, situations where computerized charges appeared without corresponding toll records. The search took several minutes to run, the computer processing thousands of customer accounts, and when the results appeared on her screen, Dorothy felt her stomach drop. There were 14 other accounts showing the exact same pattern. Phantom long-distance charges that existed in the billing system but had no basis in the actual call records. Dorothy printed out the list of affected accounts and studied it carefully. The 15 customers lived in different neighborhoods scattered across the Denver metropolitan area and extending into Boulder and Colorado Springs. They had different phone service packages, different billing cycles, different account histories. Nothing obvious connected them except for this single anomaly, the presence of phantom long-distance charges on their bills. She noted with interest that none of the other 14 customers had called to complain about the erroneous charges. Dr. Chambers' dispute seemed to be the only one that had brought the problem to the company's attention. This suggested that either the other customers had not noticed the charges, which seemed unlikely given the amounts involved, or they were aware of the charges and chose not to dispute them, which raised even more unsettling questions. Dorothy pulled the detailed records for 2 of the other affected accounts and examined the phantom charges. Like Dr. Chambers' account, these showed long-distance calls to various numbers across the country, calls that appeared legitimate in every respect except for their complete absence from the toll records. The destinations were different from those on Dr. Chambers' bill, but the pattern was similar. Several calls per month, mostly during evening hours, lasting between 5 and 30 minutes each. It looked exactly like normal long-distance calling behavior, except that the calls had never actually been made. By lunchtime, Dorothy had a hypothesis that she hesitated to voice even to herself. Someone had deliberately inserted false charges into the billing system for these 15 accounts. But the false charges were not intended to defraud the customers. Instead, they appeared to serve as cover for something else, a way to create the appearance of long-distance calls that had actually been made from different locations entirely. The more Dorothy thought about it, the more sense this theory made. If someone wanted to make long-distance calls without leaving a record traceable to their actual location, they could theoretically manipulate the billing system to show those calls as originating from random customer accounts. The real calls would still appear in the toll records under the actual originating numbers, but the bills sent to customers would show false information that disguised the true source of the calls. This would allow someone to communicate with distant parties while obscuring their identity and location. But who would need such elaborate concealment? And more importantly, who would have both the technical knowledge to manipulate Mountain Bell's billing systems and the motive to use that capability for covert communications? Dorothy felt a chill run through her as she considered the most logical answer. During her years at the telephone company, she had occasionally attended security briefings where management warned employees about the importance of protecting customer information and maintaining the integrity of telecommunications infrastructure. These briefings, delivered by stern-faced men who never quite identified which government agency they represented, had emphasized that telephone records could be valuable intelligence targets. Foreign agents might seek to compromise telephone company employees or systems in order to monitor communications or conceal their own activities. Dorothy had always treated these warnings as abstract security theater, the kind of hypothetical threats that existed in spy novels but rarely materialized in actual practice. Now, sitting at her desk with 15 customer accounts displaying impossible call records, Dorothy wondered if she had stumbled onto exactly the kind of compromise those security briefings had warned about. Someone with access to Mountain Bell's systems had manipulated billing records to conceal long-distance communications. The manipulation was sophisticated enough to evade routine detection, inserted into the computer database in a way that appeared superficially legitimate. The only reason Dorothy had discovered it, at all, was because Dr. Chambers had disputed his charges, forcing a detailed reconciliation that revealed the discrepancy between billing records and toll records. Dorothy spent her lunch hour in her car, eating a sandwich from home, while she wrestled with what to do about her discovery. She could report the anomaly to her supervisor, framing it as a technical problem requiring investigation by the company's data processing department. But something about the situation suggested that keeping it within normal channels might be the wrong approach. If someone at Mountain Bell was manipulating billing records for espionage purposes, they likely had enough access and influence to bury an internal investigation before it revealed anything significant. The security briefings she had attended had included contact information for reporting suspicious activities. Dorothy had filed those handouts away and never expected to use them, but now she dug through her desk drawer until she found the crumpled pamphlet. It listed a phone number for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Denver field office, along with instructions to call immediately if employees observed unusual attempts to access telephone company systems or records. Dorothy sat in her car, staring at the phone number, feeling increasingly ridiculous. What was she going to tell the FBI? That some customer accounts had billing discrepancies? They would think she was wasting their time with routine accounting problems. But the alternative was to ignore what she had found, to treat it as a technical glitch and move on with her work. And Dorothy knew in her gut that this was not a glitch. This was something deliberate, something sophisticated, something that suggested capabilities and intentions far beyond normal telecommunications fraud. She returned to her desk and called the FBI number from her office phone. A woman answered with crisp professionalism, and Dorothy stumbled through an explanation of who she was and why she was calling. The receptionist transferred her to an agent who listened with patient neutrality as Dorothy described the phantom billing charges and her theory about what they might represent. When she finished, there was a pause on the line. The agent, who had identified himself as Special Agent Robert Morrison, asked several specific questions about the billing system, the nature of the discrepancies, and Dorothy's access to customer records. His questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of telecommunications infrastructure that suggested this was not the first time he had investigated telephone-related intelligence matters. He asked Dorothy if she could provide documentation of what she had found, the affected account numbers, the phantom call records, and the corresponding toll tickets that showed no such calls had been made. Dorothy said she could compile that information, though it would take some time to gather everything while maintaining her normal work. Responsibilities. Agent Morrison told her not to discuss her findings with anyone at Mountain Bell, not her supervisor, not her colleagues, not even the customers whose accounts showed the anomalies. He explained that if her suspicions were correct, if someone was indeed manipulating the billing system for intelligence purposes, then alerting them to the investigation could compromise the FBI's ability to identify and apprehend the responsible parties. Dorothy agreed to maintain silence, though it made her deeply uncomfortable to continue her routine work while concealing such significant findings from her employer. Agent Morrison arranged to meet her the following evening at a restaurant in Littleton, a southern Denver suburb far from both the telephone company offices and the FBI headquarters, where their meeting would appear to be a chance social encounter rather than a covert exchange of information. The next day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Dorothy processed her normal caseload of billing disputes and account reconciliations, maintaining her usual professional demeanor while her mind raced with implications of what she had discovered. She compiled the documentation Agent Morrison had requested, printing out account records and toll tickets in small batches that would not attract attention from her colleagues. She placed the documents in a manila folder that she hid in her large purse and tried not to think about the fact that she was essentially smuggling company records out of the building, even if for legitimate law enforcement purposes. That evening, Dorothy met Agent Morrison at a Mexican restaurant in Littleton. He was in his mid-40s with thinning brown hair and the kind of face that would be instantly forgotten in a crowd, which Dorothy assumed was an asset in his profession. He ordered coffee and nachos to justify their presence at the table, then carefully reviewed the documents Dorothy had brought. As he studied the records, his expression grew increasingly serious. "This is very good work, Mrs. Hansen," Morrison said quietly, making notes in a small, leather-bound notebook. "You have identified exactly the kind of anomaly we worry about in communications infrastructure. The manipulation you have found suggests someone with sophisticated access to your company's systems, someone who understands how billing and toll records interact, and someone who has a clear operational reason for concealing their communications." Dorothy felt simultaneous relief and anxiety at his words. Relief that her suspicions had been taken seriously, that she had not imagined significance in what might have been meaningless data patterns. Anxiety at the confirmation that she had indeed stumbled onto something serious, something that involved federal investigation and potential espionage. Morrison explained that he would need to bring in additional FBI resources to fully investigate what Dorothy had discovered. They would need to trace the phantom, calls to their actual destinations, identify who was really making these concealed communications, and determine whether the manipulation extended beyond these 15 accounts. He also warned Dorothy that the investigation would likely take considerable time, possibly months, and that she would need to continue her normal work without giving any indication that something unusual was being examined. "Can you do that?" Morrison asked, looking at her intently. "Can you continue processing billing disputes, working with these compromised accounts, while knowing that federal agents are conducting surveillance based on the information you provided? It will require considerable self-control and discretion." Dorothy thought about Carl, about her quiet, suburban life, about the comfortable routine she had built over decades of telephone company employment. She thought about her father, who had served in the Pacific during World War II, and rarely spoke about his experiences, but had instilled in his children a fundamental sense of civic duty. She told Morrison she could do what was needed. Over the following weeks, Dorothy became an unwitting participant in a counterintelligence operation that existed completely separate from her visible life. She maintained her normal work schedule, arriving at the telephone company at 8 o'clock each morning and leaving at 4:30 each afternoon. She processed billing disputes with her usual thoroughness, approved credits for overcharges, and investigated technical problems affecting customer accounts. But she also maintained careful records of any new phantom charges that appeared on the 15 compromised accounts, documenting them in coded notes she kept in a personal notebook rather than in the official company systems. Every 10 days, Dorothy would meet with Agent Morrison at rotating locations around Denver, coffee shops and restaurants, and once even a public library, where she would pass him updated documentation showing the continued manipulation of the billing records. Morrison provided little information about the FBI's investigation, citing operational security requirements, but he assured Dorothy that her cooperation was proving invaluable and that significant progress was being made in identifying the individuals responsible for the billing manipulation. Dorothy learned to live with constant low-level anxiety, the knowledge that she was participating in something far beyond her experience and expertise. She told Carl only that she was helping the FBI with a work-related matter without providing details. Carl, who had long ago learned not to press his wife when she had decided something was not open for discussion, accepted this explanation and simply made sure she ate properly and got enough sleep during those stressful weeks. In late January of 1982, nearly 3 months after Dorothy's initial discovery, Agent Morrison called her at home on a Saturday morning and asked if she could meet him immediately. His tone carried an urgency that made Dorothy's pulse quicken. She told Carl she needed to run an errand and drove to a shopping center parking lot where Morrison waited in an unmarked sedan. Morrison invited her to sit in his car, where she would not be visible to passers-by. He looked tired, but grimly satisfied, the expression of someone who had worked intensely toward a goal and finally achieved it. "Mrs. Hansen, we made arrests this morning," Morrison said without preamble. "The investigation you initiated has led to the apprehension of 3 individuals involved in a Soviet intelligence operation. Your observation about the phantom billing charges was absolutely correct. Someone at Mountain Bell had been manipulating your company's systems to conceal communications between Soviet agents operating in Colorado and their handlers in other parts of the country." Dorothy felt the world tilt slightly. Soviet agents. The words carried implications straight out of spy novels and Cold War thrillers, not the mundane reality of her suburban Denver life. She asked who had been arrested, expecting to hear about some shadowy figures she would never have encountered. Morrison consulted his notebook and said that one of the arrested individuals was Carl Hoffman, a senior programmer in Mountain Bell's data processing department who had worked for the company for 12 years. Dorothy knew Carl Hoffman. Not well, but she had interacted with him numerous times when investigating technical problems with the billing system. He was a quiet man in his late 30s, competent and helpful, with no obvious characteristics that would mark him as anything other than an ordinary telephone company programmer. Morrison explained that Hoffman was not himself a Soviet agent, but rather what intelligence services called an access agent, someone recruited to provide specific capabilities without necessarily being fully integrated into espionage operations. Hoffman had been approached several years earlier by someone who claimed to represent a private investigation firm seeking assistance in tracking specific telephone numbers for divorce cases. The approach had been carefully calibrated, offering Hoffman supplemental income for what seemed like minor ethical violations rather than outright espionage. Over time, Hoffman had been gradually recruited deeper into the operation, his initial small acts of data access escalating to more sophisticated manipulation of billing records. By the time he realized he was working for Soviet intelligence rather than private investigators, he was already too compromised to extricate himself without facing criminal charges. He continued providing access to Mountain Bell's systems because he feared the consequences of refusing, not out of any ideological commitment to the Soviet Union. The other two individuals arrested were the actual intelligence operatives who had been using Hoffman's access to conceal their communications. Morrison did not provide their names or specific details about their operations, citing ongoing classified investigations, but he indicated that they had been conducting intelligence gathering related to defense contractors and military installations in the Rocky Mountain region. The manipulation of Mountain Bell's billing records had allowed them to communicate with their handlers without creating telephone records that could be traced to their actual locations. It was an elegant system, Morrison admitted with grudging professional respect. By creating phantom charges on random customer accounts, they dispersed the evidence across dozens of innocent civilians who would never think to question a few extra long-distance calls on their bills. The only reason we caught them was because Dr. Chambers was meticulous about reviewing his phone bill and noticed charges for calls he knew he had never made. And the only reason that led anywhere was because you understood your company's systems well enough to recognize that the discrepancy represented something more than a simple billing error. Dorothy asked what would happen to the people who had been arrested. Morrison said that Hoffman would likely face charges related to unauthorized access to telecommunications systems and conspiracy to commit espionage. The sentence would depend on his cooperation with prosecutors and his willingness to testify about how he had been recruited and manipulated. The two Soviet operatives would face more serious charges under espionage statutes and would likely spend decades in federal prison unless they became part of prisoner exchange negotiations. Dorothy felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for Hoffman, who had made catastrophically poor decisions but had apparently been motivated more by weakness and fear than by malice or ideology. She asked Morrison if her name would become public as part of the investigation. Morrison assured her that the FBI would protect her identity, listing her in court documents only as a confidential source. The telephone company would be notified that their systems had been compromised, but would not be told which employee had identified the problem. Dorothy could continue her work without her colleagues knowing about her role in the investigation. The arrests received modest coverage in Denver newspapers, reported as a spy case involving Soviet agents gathering intelligence on defense contractors. The articles mentioned that the operatives had been identified through investigation of telephone company records, but provided no details about how that investigation had been initiated. Dorothy read the news coverage in her kitchen, drinking coffee and feeling a surreal disconnect between the dramatic language of espionage and international intrigue and her own mundane contribution of noticing billing discrepancies. Over the following months, Dorothy gradually returned to her normal routine, processing billing disputes and investigating account problems without the overlay of federal investigation. Agent Morrison visited her once more, several weeks after the arrests, to formally thank her for her cooperation and to present her with a letter of commendation from the FBI director. The letter acknowledged her contribution to national security in carefully worded language that avoided classified details. Dorothy placed it in her desk drawer alongside her children's school awards and her 20-year service certificate from Mountain Bell. She never framed it or showed it to anyone except Carl, who read it quietly and then kissed her forehead and told her he was proud of her. The case against the arrested individuals proceeded slowly through the federal court system. Hoffman eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his testimony against the Soviet operatives. The two intelligence officers were convicted on multiple counts of espionage and received sentences of 25 and 30 years, respectively. The trials received some national attention, particularly among intelligence professionals who studied the case as an example of how sophisticated operations could be compromised by attention to mundane details. In 1984, Dorothy attended a security conference organized by the telecommunications industry where the case was discussed as a cautionary example, though no names were mentioned and Dorothy's role remained undisclosed. A FBI presenter described how a telephone company employee's routine work had led to the identification of system compromise, emphasizing that frontline workers who understood their organization's normal operations were often the best positioned to detect anomalies suggesting hostile activity. Dorothy listened to the presentation from the back of the conference room, maintaining the same anonymous competence that had defined her entire career. She never told anyone she was the employee being discussed, never claimed credit for the investigation she had initiated. Years later, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, Dorothy would occasionally think about that Tuesday morning in November 1981, when she had looked at Dr. Chambers's billing records and recognized that something was fundamentally wrong. She would think about how close she had come to dismissing the anomaly as a technical glitch, to letting it disappear into the vast flow of data that passed through the telephone company's systems every day. She would think about Carl Hoffman, who had made a series of small compromises that accumulated into catastrophic betrayal, whose desire for extra income had been weaponized by intelligence professionals who recognized his vulnerability. She would think about the 15 customers whose accounts had been manipulated, ordinary people who became unknowing participants in espionage operations simply because their phone numbers happened to be selected as cover for covert communications. And she would think about the peculiar accident of it all, how an operation that had successfully concealed communications for years had been exposed because one customer disputed his bill and one billing analyst understood her company's systems well enough to recognize impossible data. Dorothy Hansen retired from Mountain Bell in 1995 after 37 years of service. Her retirement party was held in the same conference room where she had attended countless meetings, and her colleagues presented her with a crystal clock and a photo album filled with memories from nearly 4 decades of work. The speeches praised her attention to detail, her institutional knowledge, her reliability, and dedication. No one mentioned the spy case. No one knew. She sometimes wondered how many other discoveries had been made by people like herself. Ordinary professionals doing ordinary work who happened to notice something wrong and chose to investigate rather than ignore. The history of intelligence and counterintelligence was filled with dramatic operations and sophisticated technical capabilities. But it also depended on these small moments of attention, when someone looked carefully at data that everyone else took for granted and recognized patterns that should not exist. In Dorothy's case, the pattern had been phantom telephone charges on customer bills, charges that represented calls never made from the numbers they were supposedly billed to. In other cases, it might be financial records that did not balance properly, or shipping manifests that showed impossibilities, or technical specifications that contradicted physical reality. The common thread was simple human observation, the willingness to trust one's expertise and pursue anomalies even when doing so required courage and created complications. The Cold War had been fought through such observations, accumulated across thousands of individuals who noticed small things and decided those small things mattered. Dorothy Hansen had been one of those individuals, contributing to national security not through heroic action or specialized training, but through meticulous attention to the details of her everyday work. She had recognized that billing records did not match toll records, understood that the discrepancy suggested deliberate manipulation rather than innocent error, and made the decision to report what she had found to authorities who could investigate properly. Her contribution would never be publicly acknowledged, never celebrated in newspapers or history books, never taught as a case study, except in classified briefings for intelligence professionals. But it had mattered. 3 people had been arrested and convicted because Dorothy Hansen had looked carefully at telephone bills and recognized something wrong. A Soviet intelligence operation that had successfully concealed communications for years had been exposed and dismantled. The telephone company's systems had been secured against future compromise. And a small number of defense contractors and military installations in Colorado had been protected from intelligence gathering that might have compromised their operations or endangered American service members. This was the unglamorous reality of Cold War espionage. Not the dramatic chases and daring operations depicted in movies, but the patient work of ordinary people who paid attention to their jobs and trusted their instincts when something seemed wrong. Dorothy's story represented thousands of similar stories that remained classified or unknown. Small victories in a long conflict that was won through accumulation rather than decisive battle. On quiet mornings in her retirement, Dorothy would sometimes drive past the building where she had worked for so many years, watching new employees arrive for their shifts and wondering if any of them would face similar situations. The Cold War had ended, but threats to national security remained, evolving with technology and geopolitics but still depending ultimately on human observation and judgment. She hoped that if those employees ever encountered something wrong, something that did not fit their understanding of how their systems should work, they would trust their expertise enough to investigate, rather than ignore. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.